Welcome to For Better or For Court, Family Law in New Jersey.
Welcome back to For Better or For Court, Family Law in New Jersey with Ms. Alix Claps. Alix is a partner at Heyman and Fletcher and a certified matrimonial law attorney who helps New Jersey families navigate divorce, custody, and family matters with clarity and care. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about domestic violence. We'll look into how the protection orders work in Jersey, what victims can expect from the process, and how the legal system can help keep families safe. Ms. Alix, my dear, welcome back.
Hi, Evan. How are you?
I'm swell. Now, we're talking about a heavy topic, but it's something I think is very important and information that people need to know, especially if they're in Jersey. For listeners who may not know, how does Jersey law actually define domestic violence?
Well, there's two parts of it. First, you have to have a domestic relationship. So that's got to be family relationship, dating relationship, something like that, a sibling relationship, see parents and children sometimes, grandparents and grandchildren, boyfriend and girlfriend, sometimes not even technically boyfriend, girlfriend. We've had them where as little as, one night stand can qualify for a domestic relation qualifying partnership there. And then you have to have an act of domestic violence. And that in New Jersey falls into a number, I think it's about 15 categories now. And you have to have a predicate act, which means an act kind of immediately before the seeking of a restraining order that falls into one of those categories.
When someone comes to you afraid, for their safety, what's the very first legal step that you can take to protect them?
Well, first step is getting a restraining order. If there's genuine fear for physical safety, and I'll say thankfully, a lot of times it's not immediate physical safety. I've gotten 150 text messages from my spouse and it's out of control. They are, making rude comments, harassing comments, things like that. Or we live in the same house and it has gotten toxic and our fights have gotten out of control and I don't know what to do and it's a bad environment. If they're in serious fear for their immediate safety, then we march right down to the police station and we deal with that immediately. If it's something slightly more nuanced, I want to make sure they've put together a robust complaint for domestic violence, by which I mean they're specific in their allegations so that, we've got the due process portion of this covered. The defendant has to know what they're being accused of. So we put together the complaint, we put together the history. In New Jersey, a history of domestic violence is very important as well to give the court some context about why is, the last 24 hours of messages so alarming? Is it because you've put up with this same pattern for years, or is it because this is relatively new? This is an escalation of behavior and you're concerned about where it's headed.
Can you walk us through the difference between a temporary restraining order or a final restraining order in Jersey?
Yes, temporary restraining order is relatively easy to get. It's the ham sandwich. So, you can indict a ham sandwich is the old joke in criminal. The temporary restraining order in New Jersey is the ham sandwich. You can get it ex parte, which means you go and you talk to the police and likely a municipal court judge if you do it at the police station, or you can go to your county courthouse at the Superior Court, speak to the DV unit and get heard by a Superior Court judge. They're going to ask you some questions, but basically you're going to tell your side of the story and they're going to decide if there is a need for a temporary restraining order. A temporary restraining order is still robust. It means that whatever your relationship is, the defendant can be barred from the home. If you share a home, that is, you can't be together while there's a restraining order. So the defendant is barred from the home. Firearms are seized by the police when there's a temporary restraining order, which sometimes means that the defendant is suspended from their job. If they are in law enforcement, if they work in a job where a firearm is a necessity, there's no exception for that in New Jersey. So a temporary restraining order comes with, a lot of ramifications. It can mean suspension of parenting time, or supervised parenting time, or needing to involve a third party to make sure parenting time is happening. It can mean needing an order for financial support so that in the meantime, the lights stay on, things like that. Then the temporary restraining order is served on the defendant. They're made aware of what the restrictions are, and there's a return date set when we come back for the final restraining order hearing. Usually that initial date is supposed to be within 10 days of when that order is served. The whole process is supposed to be wrapped up within 30 days. Wow. That is aspirational. That is hard to do because there are too many complaints and too few judges. But assuming that's what happens, assuming you get your return date, 10 days later, you come in and you're ready for trial. Then the plaintiff has to prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence that both the defendant committed a predicate act of domestic violence and that a final restraining order is necessary to prevent further acts of abuse. A final restraining order in New Jersey is permanent. It's one of only 2 states in the United States where it's permanent. It doesn't expire after a year. It doesn't expire after 2 years. We can get to it later, but there are ways that a final restraining order can be lifted, but the burden is very high. So this is a very serious order in New Jersey, especially for such a short procedure. There's no discovery. It's called a summary proceeding. That's the technical name for it. It happens very fast, and you're not entitled to discovery. You're not entitled to get all the information. You're not entitled to get an expert. It happens fast.
So what kind of behaviors or evidence typically support this restraining order, since it's so serious in New Jersey, and what doesn't?
It's tough. I find that there are cases where a final restraining order and all of its robust protections are absolutely necessary, are extremely important. And then there are cases where I think it's a bazooka being used as a fly swatter, where you've got, I had a case a couple of years ago. Boyfriend, girlfriend broke up. Boyfriend sent a series of really vile and disgusting emails. I'm not going to defend the emails, but as a result, girlfriend got the final restraining order, and boyfriend can no longer train to become a pilot because he won't pass a background check. And I am personally of the opinion that is too strong, too severe an outcome for the circumstances that were present there. But the court doesn't have discretion about that. That is something that is not left up to the judges. The judges have to make their findings, but what follows therefrom is not up to them. It's statutory. And the predicate acts, they range from things like harassment, which can be emails, text messages, phone calls, other communications, assault, undoubtedly serious, sexual assault, terroristic threats, criminal mischief. Sometimes criminal mischief is like they knocked a hole in the drywall. No, they didn't injure a person. They didn't even necessarily have to do it deliberately. I had a case a couple of years ago where ex-husband was at the ex-wife's house because he had dropped the kids off and got plastered and trashed the apartment. She wasn't home. Wow. It was not a good thing. And really what he needed was rehab. And he consented to the entry of the final restraining order in that circumstance because he also had plenty of criminal charges related to that. But that was an unfortunate circumstance. You also have things like criminal trespass as a predicate act. Of all of the predicate acts, harassment and simple assault are by far, I think they're combined to 70% of domestic violence predicate acts that exist in New Jersey for the filings. They're by far the most common.
How quickly can these orders be issued, though? What kind of proof does the court really need at that initial stage? You say you don't need discovery and things like that, but what do they need to make those things happen?
Less than I sometimes hoped they would. It's funny. I'm doing an appeal right now. I'm in the process of doing the appeal, and there is no clear evidential standard for the entry of a temporary restraining order. It's something like it's necessary to protect the immediate safety of the plaintiff. But judges are understandably sort of, I would say, overly generous in the issuance of a temporary restraining order. Because I'll also say maybe 25% of temporary restraining orders actually go through the full process and have a final restraining order hearing. And even fewer of those end up with the entry of a final restraining order. So a lot of times the temporary restraining order serves an important purpose, which it allows everybody to cool down. And then the other process is sometimes plaintiffs just dismiss them. And sometimes plaintiffs and defendants through counsel reach an agreement, what we call a civil restraints agreement or a civil restraints order. Again, it's a technical thing. So there can either be an agreement or it can be an order signed by a judge, depending on other circumstances. And the agreement sort of sets forth any parameters for communications in the future. Happens most when the predicate act is harassment and these people have a reason why they have to interact in the future, like they share a child. So having a final restraining order can be an obstacle to co-parenting. Doesn't mean it's not sometimes absolutely necessary. But if you can do civil restraints where you can say, all right, we're not going to do text messages. We're going to utilize a third-party application where all of our communications are timestamped and tracked and non-modifiable and not deletable. And I'm going to know when you open it and when you respond, and you're going to know when I open your response. And it's got a tone monitor. So if either of us are being a little rude or use a swear word, it's going to red flag us before we even send the message. They're high level. They're pretty handy, these things. So the civil restraints agreement comes up in a lot of cases, and it can be very effective. Doesn't always work, but it's one of the ways to prevent us from going through the full trial. But getting a temporary restraining order is a same day thing. You go in and you say, I received a threatening phone call. I received these text messages. Sometimes they just say, I received text messages, and they don't present them to the court, and the court will sort of presumptively take their word for it.
Wow.
A lot of times, if a plaintiff goes into a police station, sometimes it's the result of somebody's called 911 and the police show up and the police advise, hey, you are eligible. Would you like to make an application for a temporary restraining order, domestic violence restraining order? And that's how they get to that process. Sometimes it's they walk down to the police station to file a complaint for communication, something like that. If they go in and they do that without having spoken to an attorney, and they end up hiring an attorney for the process thereafter, the attorney will frequently have them what we call amend the temporary restraining order. They'll file an application to amend, to clarify the timeline, to add that history, because sometimes they don't even realize that they've been victims of domestic violence for years, that there are other incidents that the court will want to hear about, because if it's not on the temporary restraining order, it cannot be part of a trial.
So, Miss Alex, could you share an anonymous story about a client whose life changed once they had that proper protection in place where a temporary or maybe, the full one?
Yes, I have two. I have one where we did the temporary, and we ended up converting it to civil restraints at the end, because these were people who they had been married for something like 20 years. And I don't think my client truly realized the level of just an ongoing barrage of harassing text messages that she was getting from her husband daily. I mean, she sent me like a year's worth of text, and every single day was its own sort of act of harassment, domestic violence.
Wow.
And we got their children were adults, so they still had some co-parenting to sort out. We had to sort through the divorce, but they weren't going to have to talk to each other on a regular basis. But once they weren't living together, she felt safe enough with the civil restraints that she didn't feel like she needed a final restraining order, because they weren't going to communicate anymore. They weren't going to see each other. There's an agreement about that. And if something happens in the future, it doesn't preclude her from filing another restraining order if another act of domestic violence happened. But by getting the temporary, she got into therapy with one of our local organizations, and she was really able to start to heal and to move on with her life, which is extremely important. I'll share another case where I had dad who was the victim of domestic violence from mom in front of their child. Mom attacked him in the hallway of his building in front of their kid. And while we considered doing civil restraints, it was not the first time she had been physically violent. It had escalated. The child had witnessed it, and my guy did not feel safe. So we did the trial, and the final restraining order was entered. Well, not 6 months after the final restraining order was entered, mom attacked dad again at the child's elementary school in front of 4 camera angles of footage and a whole bunch of witnesses, including like another dad who helped pull her off of out of the situation.
Wow.
And because the final restraining order was in place, mom faced criminal charges for her behavior, not just because a civil restraints agreement can only be enforced civilly, but a final restraining order has more teeth. You can face criminal charges for violation of a final restraining order.
Wow, Miss Alex, like what? So how do restraining orders like affect the custody and that parenting time while the family case is kind of ongoing? How does that kind of affect that?
So when a temporary restraining order is entered, there is a presumption that the non-domestic violence committing parent will have temporary custody. Unless there's an accusation that the act of domestic violence was also aimed at the kids, it's rare that parenting time would be suspended entirely. Sometimes parameters are put in, so the supervision or transportation help. But within the context of domestic violence, usually it's only on a temporary thing. However, if you're having a custody dispute in the other parts of the family part, the statutory factors for custody include acts of domestic violence, the child and the other parent's safety. Those are factors that the court must consider when looking at custody overall.
What should someone expect at the hearing for this final restraining order? Is it a long process? Is it more immediate? How does that work?
I've had some that have lasted an hour or two. I've had some that have lasted 9 or 10 days over the course of like 8 or 9 months. It depends on how much evidence you have. It depends on how many witnesses you have to present. And also, quite frankly, the court often gets interrupted by emergent things. So you may think you're going for a full day of trial and you only get 3 hours. And then you come back 3 months later and you got to remember where you were. And it's tough. But the temporary order stays in place until the final restraining order hearing is concluded one way or the other.
So, Alex, what happens if someone is falsely accused of domestic violence? How does that court separate that from an allegation?
It's tough because the burden of proof for the plaintiff is only preponderance of the evidence, which means the court just has to believe it is more likely true than not that an act of domestic violence occurred. But even if an act of domestic violence occurred, it doesn't mean that a final restraining order is necessary. So it's the second part of the analysis that a defendant can also use to say, look, I've been accused of this incident, but there's nothing to suggest that in the whole context of our dynamic that there is a need for the plaintiff's protection on a permanent basis.
Right.
So that's an important part.
So what community or court resources exist in Jersey for victims who may feel isolated or maybe unsure where they can start?
Almost every county has a domestic violence resource center. First, they have them in the court. There's a domestic violence unit, but then in Morris County, we have the Jersey Battered Women's Project resource. In Sussex County, it's called Daisy. Every county has their own sort of local resource center where you can go and seek advice, seek help, seek counseling, other resources, shelters, things like that. So if you Google that, in your county, you can find resources.
And Alex, finally, if someone is listening and is in a dangerous or uncertain situation right now, what's the safest way to reach out for that legal help?
You can do an anonymous or a confidential consult, certainly. You can also reach out to those domestic violence resources. I know in Morris County and Sussex County, they've got lists of attorneys who specialize in this sort of thing, so they can send you to the right attorney to help you figure out what your rights are and your options.
Awesome. Miss Alix, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening to For Better or For Court, Family Law in New Jersey. If you or someone you know needs guidance or protection, visit HeymanFletcherLaw.com to connect with Ms. Alix Claps. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share this episode with someone that might need it as well. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.